Box joints are one of my favorite ways to make drawers and other sorts of utility boxes for use around the shop. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons that most woodworkers don't use them as often as I think they should is the time it takes to get an accurate setup. Even when you have the jig already made up with the index pin, like I have here, it needs to be attached to your miter gauge, then a test joint cut, the fit adjusted, and tested again until a good fit is achieved. But I've figured out a way to avoid all of that. By using machine screws for mounting the jig to the miter gauge, and a series of glue blocks that precisely located on the miter gauge, this jig is already accurately set up as soon as it's attached, with no test cutting or adjustment needed. And I'm going to show you how to do the same in your shop. I started my jig by clamping a piece of plywood to the miter gauge, about 18 long and 4 high. Note that I left a generous amount of plywood on the far side of the blade to support the cutting of wider pieces. The first notch is cut into the board. This will be the notch for the index key. The key is carefully cut from 1/8" aluminum stock to match the exact width of the notch. The key is then secured into the notch previously cut in the jig. The key can be whatever material you want to make it out of. I just find that aluminum lasts longer and works well. An accurate setup block is used to carefully position the pin exactly the right distance away from the blade. The jig is then carefully clamped to the front of the miter gauge. Mounting locations for screws were carefully transferred through the head of the miter gauge into the backside of the jig. The hole locations are transferred through the jig with a small drill bit. Then the holes are counterbored and drilled through to accept the 1032 T-nuts. Using machine screws and the T-nuts will allow the jig to be attached and detached from the miter gauge as often as necessary, with no damage being done. At this point, the 832 screws allow for a little bit of side-to-side play in the jig. Once again, the index pin is carefully set to the blade using the setup block. The jig is then secured to the miter gauge using the machine screws. Test cuts are now made and the jig adjusted until the fit is perfect. The secret to never having to go through this test cut procedure again is to glue some small cleats to the back of the jig. These pieces are attached tight up against the head of the miter gauge, so that every time the jig is attached to the miter gauge, it always returns to the exact same location. These last 2 minutes of the video are a single take showing me setting up and using the jig with no adjustments necessary. I've made 2 of these jigs, one for 1/4" fingers and one for 3/8. So now anytime I want to make a box joint, it's only about 2 minutes away.